Welcome, Kate. Um, maybe Anders, you want to start?
Yes, we will both ask question, of course, me and Sia. And the first question we thought of was you can actually interpret this question maybe in different ways, but the first question is, do we need another economic system?
Yes, we need another economic system. Yes, we do. Because economics means the art of household management. That's where the word comes from in ancient Greek. It's two words actually, ekos and nomos. And together they mean the art of household management. This economic system is utterly mismanaging our planetary home. We are destroying the life supporting systems of the only known living planet in the universe. So this system is not working, and we need to transform it so that our economy enables us to belong and thrive on planet Earth.
And can you give us a brief description of Doughnut Economics?
Yeah, so I really like starting with this question: what is the shape of progress? And the 20th century, if we listen to our politicians' speeches, to economists' advice, the shape of progress that we've inherited in our minds looks like this. It's endless growth, and it's measured in terms of GDP or national income. No matter how rich a nation already is, you're in Sweden, I'm in the UK, we live in two of the richest nations in the history of humankind. And yet, our politicians and our economists believe that the solution to our nation's problems is yet more growth, endlessly. So, we've inherited a very powerful 20th century idea that growth is success. I believe we need to think again and come up with a new shape of progress. And this is where the donut comes in. So you don't need to eat donuts to go for donut economics because the most important one is conceptual. And here it is. I offer this as a compass for human prosperity in the 21st century. So the goal here, if we think of how humanity uses Earth's resources, the goal here is to leave no one in this hole. This is where people are falling short on the essentials of life. This is where people don't have the resources they need to have good food, clean water, housing, good education and healthcare, income, political voice, mobility. All of these come from the Sustainable Development Goals, which means that the world's governments have already agreed that every person in the world has a claim to meeting these essentials. Leave no one in the hole. But, and this is a very big but, we know that as humanity uses Earth's resources, as we convert land for agriculture, as we find and burn fossil fuels, as we cut trees for timber, as we take fish from the sea, as we use Earth's resources, we start to put pressure on this planetary home of ours. And we're going to hit this ecological ceiling where we put so much pressure on our planetary home that we begin to kick Earth's life supporting systems out of balance. We begin to destabilize the climate. We begin to destroy the integrity of biodiversity and ecosystems. We convert too much land for human use. We withdraw too much water from lakes and rivers. We create a hole in the ozone layer. So we must live within this ecological ceiling, these 9 planetary boundaries. So, put it in the simplest of terms, here's the goal of the donut: leave no one falling short on the essentials of life in the hole in the donut, but don't overshoot the life supporting systems of this delicately balanced living planet. And when we start there with that as our goal, the shape of progress is utterly transformed. It's not never ending growth, it's balance. It's finding that balance between the social foundation and the ecological ceiling of the donut. Thriving in balance, that's where health lies. And I believe this is the shape of progress for the 21st century. The challenge here is, if this is progress and the state of balance, we are very far from that right now. As all of the red in this picture shows, this, I call it the selfie of humanity and our planetary home. Billions of people in the world are falling short on the essentials of life. 11% of people worldwide don't have enough food to eat every day. So this little red wedge goes 11% of the way to the center of the circle. We want to eliminate all of the red so that nobody is left falling short on the essentials of life. But we've got to do that while recognizing that we've already overshot multiple planetary boundaries on climate breakdown, on excessive fertilizer use, converting too much land, and biodiversity loss. We've got to come back within planetary boundaries at the same time. And this is a direction of progress that hasn't been pursued before. How do we meet the needs of all people at the same time as coming back within the means of our living planet? For some people, that's really overwhelming. And for other people, it's a phenomenal opportunity to realize that we need to redesign our economies. That means redesigning the way we think about economic success. It means new kinds of businesses. It means new kinds of government policies. It means new kinds of community organizing and new ways of living. It's a transformation we need to come and belong again on this planet.
Thanks. So can you tell us a little bit about the background on how the Doughnut model came about and how you came to this topic also?
So I worked for many years at the United Nations and with Oxfam, working on issues of human rights, workers' rights in global supply chains, working on issues of protecting the environment, stopping climate change. And I always wanted to bring them together because I believe they belong together and will only be solved when we address them together. And then one day I saw a diagram which had been drawn up by some Earth system scientists, in fact, led by a Swedish scientist who I know is very well known, Johan Rockström. And this diagram was a circle showing that there were 9 planetary boundaries, 9 life-supporting systems for planet Earth that keep this delicately balanced living planet in a stable state that's so benevolent to humanity, but that we were already overshooting multiple of these planetary boundaries. Sitting at my desk in Oxfam, I was struck by this diagram. It hit me that economics needs to be practiced within that circle. We need to create economies that work within the planetary boundaries. That seems so obvious. But at the same time, I was thinking, well, if there's an outer limit of pressure that human economies should put on this planet, for each person, there's also an inner limit of resource use that's required to meet our human rights. And so inside their circle, I drew a second circle and it turned into a donut. That's how it came about. What really struck me is as soon as we published this, just as an idea in Oxfam, lots of people started using it. And it taught me 2 things. One, the power of pictures. The pictures that we draw and that we teach and that we use really shape what we see and what we don't see in the world. They determine what's put at the center of our vision and what's left at the margins, what's made visible and what's left invisible. And by making in the donut, by starting with the rights of every person and the integrity of the living planet, this just changes the economic conversation. Because the first question we ask is, what kind of economy can we design that will actually bring humanity into this space? And it sets a completely different vision for what success looks like. But I also realized in this process the importance of addressing these 2 things at the same time together. There is no way that 9 or 10 billion people in this world can have good food, water, health, security, housing, community if we destabilize the climate and destroy ecosystems. We have to address these issues together. Social justice and climate justice are deeply intertwined. So bringing them together in one diagram means that people who care about both, and many, many people care about both, can talk about it in the same breath, can address it in the same conversation, can challenge the economic system to deal with them both at the same time.
Yeah, we both agree totally on that the current economic system is deeply problematic. And the question is, how deep does the problem go? How much of the institutions that we now have dealing with resources like labor or knowledge or materials in nature that we use for building things. I've come across that you have talked about the problem of neoliberalism, and I wonder, is it even deeper than that the problem goes, or how deep would you say the problem is in current system?
Oh, okay. Where's the answer to that question? How deep the problem is? Okay. How can I begin? So we've inherited an economic mindset that creates institutions, businesses, and government regulation that are focused around two really destructive dynamics. First, we've inherited economic systems that are linear and degenerative by design, right? With a bit of hosepipe, we take those materials, stick them in the pipe of production, use them for a while, often only once, and then we throw them away. And this take, make, use, lose of Earth's resources is what's pushing us over planetary boundaries. And it's business as usual. This is the norm of business that we've inherited from the industrial era. This is how we think things are done. And we burn fossil fuels as the form of energy to make business work like that. This is destroying the life support systems of our planetary home. So we need to transform. We need to create enterprise and business that is circular, cyclical, or regenerative by design, so that resources aren't used up, they're used again and again, far more carefully, collectively, creatively, and slowly. That's an utterly different way of doing business. So we've got to move from degenerative to regenerative. These are the fundamental dynamics we must shift. But at the same time, I'd argue we have inherited economies that tend to be deeply divisive by design. Through regulation and privilege and inheritance and infrastructure, we tend to capture value and opportunity in the hands of a few. And we're seeing this globally with the rise of a 1%. The number of billionaires in the world has more than doubled over the past decade. Once there were 1,000 billionaires, there's now more than 2,000 billionaires. And the COVID crisis has supercharged this even more. In a world of extreme inequalities, there is no chance of meeting the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. So we need to transform this deeply divisive economic system into a distributive one, where resources are shared far more equitably with everybody who co-creates them. That's transformational, because it turns out that that means everybody in society. So from degenerative to regenerative, from divisive to distributive. These are the profound dynamics we need to transform. Then your question, how deep does this go? We've inherited economic structures, and I think particularly the design of business and enterprise, that from the 20th century, one very dominant design came through, which is the idea that the purpose and the goal, and actually the responsibility of business, is to maximize the financial value that it can extract and pay out to the owners. And that sits at the heart of, I think, of a neoliberal project that puts markets first, use the market, because governments will get in the way and governments won't do a good job. So the neoliberal story goes, let the market dominate, and we will succeed by allowing people to pursue profit maximization and their own self-interest. Now, markets are very powerful. Adam Smith was onto something when he praised the power of the market. They can coordinate the needs and wants of billions of people every day, buyers and sellers who never may need meet, who may never talk, but it connects them and coordinates them through the price mechanism. It's ingenious. There's just two small problems. Markets only value, no, let me say that again. There's just two small problems. Markets only serve those who can pay, and the rest they ignore. And markets only value what's priced. The rest they exploit. So those aren't small problems at all, of course. These are massive problems. And it means that if we have societies and economies that are dominated by the idea that markets first, let the market rule, we will see millions and billions of people's fundamental needs totally unmet because they currently can't pay. And we will see nature and vulnerable workers and unpaid caring work exploited. So we need to transform an economic system so that instead of the idea that business should aim to extract as much value for its owners through the power of the market, we need to embed that in a far richer vision of the different ways that we meet our wants and needs. So when I say I think economic systems need to be transformed, I'm not saying scrap everything we have and start again. We can't do that because we need to eat every day. We need energy and travel and connection every day. We need to transform these systems by working with them, transforming them deep within. And I think we need to go for deep the design of the systems we've inherited. So let's talk about business. Some companies really want to be part of transforming the future. They want to become regenerative of the living world. They want to sequester carbon rather than releasing it. They want to become socially responsible. They want to pay more than living wages throughout their supply chains rather than exploiting workers. How can businesses actually do business in this way that it's never been done before? I think what really matters is not the design of their products. Ultimately, it's the design of the enterprise itself. And there are 5 deep design traits that I always look at when I'm considering any particular company. And I invite anybody watching this to think of a company you know, one that you love, one that you hate, one whose products you buy, one that you would never buy. Think of that company and be a detective about its deep design. Here are the 5 design traits. So, first of all, what is the purpose of this company? Why does it even exist in the world? What is it in service to in the world? Is it helping bring humanity in the donut, or is actually its purpose is driving us out? 2, how is it networked? How does it relate to its customers, to its own employees, to its suppliers who produce its product? And does it hold its value in those relationships? 3, how is this company governed? Who is in the room when decisions are made and who has voice in that decision making? What are the metrics by which it measures its own success? What are the hard rules of the company? And what's the culture of how things get done? The further down we go, the deeper it goes. How is this company owned? Because how a company is owned, whether it's owned by a founding entrepreneur, by a family for 300 years, whether it's owned by shareholders or venture capital, or by its employees or by the state, these are all designs of companies that exist today, very, very different forms of ownership. And that profoundly shapes what sits at the bottom here, how it's financed, where the money is coming from, and what that finance expects and demands, and how much of the profits that it generates, because companies need to generate profits. That's what makes a business. How much of the profits it generates are extracted as payouts to the owners, and how much is reinvested in the purpose. So these 5 design traits, what's your purpose? How are you networked? How are you governed? How is this company owned? And how is it financed? These tell us so much about what a company can do and be in the world. From the 20th century, I think we inherited models of big business that we were told this is successful business, designed to extract as much financial value for the owners, whether they're shareholders or the private owners or the venture capitalists, and to put sort of as little as needed back into the purpose. I want to redesign the future of business so that when profits are generated, they are reinvested in the very purpose that it serves. And this is completely possible. There are already some companies that are owned by their employees or that are owned by people as stewards of the future who say, I don't want big payouts at all. I want this business to be a vehicle for transforming the future. Purpose first. So mission primacy rather than profit primacy. Let's redesign the future of business by redesigning the deep design of companies in the world. That will take us a long way to the future we need. And while we're there, we need to redesign the regulatory environment in which business happens. So we need governments to incentivize and encourage and enable companies to be purpose driven. We need governments to make it possible for them to be incorporated in ways that are owned far more socially and community, like a cooperative or an employee-owned company or a socially purposed enterprise. We need finance that is not there to serve itself, but that's there to serve the real economy. So reinventing the finance of the future is key to making it possible for business to help bring humanity into the donut.
Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do inside of the Doughnut Economics Action Lab, like, and a little bit more about how you work with the donut in a practical sense, like in which way different cities, communities, and companies are like concretizing this model.
Yep, sure. Hang on. Only if this is fun to include. I'm not at all trying to promote a book, but I'm just trying to say, okay, so I wrote a book called Doughnut Economics. Here it is in Swedish. And when this came out in 2017, what struck me was the number of people who came up to me and said, I find this book really exciting and the ideas of how to think like a 21st century economist really exciting, but I'm putting it into practice. I'm a teacher and I'm bringing this into the classroom already. I'm creating a startup and I'm going to design my company around these principles. I'm a town councillor and I'm bringing this into our next town council meeting. I'm a community organizer and I'm taking this into my community about how we transition to a carbon-free future. I was really struck by the hunger and excitement of people who say, yes, new economic thinking, not just thinking, new economic doing. Let's put this into practice. So I co-founded Doughnut Economics Action Lab in order to bring together these practitioners who were already putting these ideas into practice. I think there's a real danger that we critique the old economy and come up with all the things that are wrong with it and come up with some new ideas for what we could do. But I profoundly believe that 21st century economics is going to be practiced first and theorized later. And sometimes one of the most powerful forms of protest is to propose something new and show that this alternative can work. So we set up Doughnut Economics Action Lab to work with communities and cities and businesses and teachers to bring these ideas into practice. And it's a platform online. Anybody's welcome to browse our tools and resources. It's at doughuteconomics.org. Have a look at who's in the community. Join the community. See the tools that we're already putting out there, and then the stories that people are sharing back about how they're bringing this into practice, because we're inventing as we go. Let me give an example from cities. A lot of cities know that they need to transform and are choosing to use the Doughnut framework as the overarching framework and vision setting for the future of the city they want to become. How can their city meet the needs of all people, bring back local ecological richness in the cityscape, but also respect the health of the whole planet and the well-being of people worldwide? So we're seeing cities from Amsterdam to Brussels to Barcelona to Melbourne to Ipoh in Malaysia, Mexico City, places all over the world engaging with this, saying, how do we go on this journey? And let's recognize that this is a long and complex journey. We can't just jump to the future that we want to become. And cities themselves are embedded in nations, that are embedded in regions, that are embedded in the global economy. So they're embedded in much wider systems that in many ways are holding them back from this transformation. So there's an inherent tension there. But let's get started where we can get started. And I think we can get started at every level, right from my own personal life and my household and my street and my town and my city and my region and my nation and the world. We need change to be happening at every one of those places. So in Deal, we work with whoever comes, because I believe there are so many change makers who are ready to make change happen where they are. And if they say, this donut looks useful for my city, I judge this is great for my context, let's go. Let's see what we can make happen.
These cities you mentioned, do you think that at the moment that they will attract companies, or will corporations be worried about these changes?
Great question. So companies need, well, where shall I start? Many cities are taking on the ambition of our times and saying, we want to be a city that thrives in the donut. And we know that we need to create neighborhoods and businesses and public services here that are part of that story. So they want to attract companies that are also on that journey. Now, companies also know, completely independently of that, that they need to transform. I mean, they have seen the message from the climate scientists. They see the breakdown of climate and ecosystems. They know that there is extreme inequality in the world. So they already know they need to transform. Companies need to have the ambition of our times to work in cities that actually want to go on that journey. Of course, a city will be a stronger place if the companies within it are on that same journey too, rather than resisting it. And it's probably challenging for one city alone that trying to change a multinational company that's got branches in 40 cities around the world. That's why this needs to join up and build critical mass. So I think we can see public movement, public purpose organizations like city administrations are moving faster in many cases than businesses, which are still pulled back. And let's go back to how they're owned. How are they owned and how are they financed? And what do those businesses really have as a purpose? If they've been designed to extract as much financial value as they can, they're going to resist the context of living within the donut. That's why we need to transform the deep design of business itself. But some cities are already incentivizing companies that are on that journey. The city of Stuttgart, for example, recognizes companies that have done a balance sheet with the economy for the common good, which is a framework which assesses whether businesses are really ambitious on their social and ecological impact. And if companies have completed that balance sheet of their own performance, and if they're doing well enough, then in Stuttgart, they get a subsidy, they get preferential treatment. That's the city rewarding the kind of business that it wants to attract. And I think that's key. I think also we'll see when networks of cities start meeting up, they can have a countervailing power in relation to companies and say, right, you companies, you want to do business in our city. We're a city that wants to be circular by design. So how is your business getting circular by design? If you want to keep doing business here, you need to transform to belong. We're only at the beginning of that journey, so it might sound a little bit unrealistic at the moment, but I see that the world is changing fast now, and the onus is going to shift fast from let me say it this way. The world's changing fast, and we've inherited a situation where business has sort of sat back and said, people who care about social environmental issues, come back to me when you have a better business case for why I should do that. So business has sat happy in its big chair and demanded that the rest of us make a good case for why they should care. This needs to flip. Now we start with the vision of the donut, the vision of the rights of all people in the integrity of the planet. Now we invite business back into that space and say, now the onus is on you to explain why your business still belongs in this future. Explain how your company is going to transform so that it's actually in service of the transformation that we all know needs to happen. Explain how your company is going to ensure that enough of its profit is reinvested in that purpose rather than extracted as value for its owners. Why should that be the purpose of business? Why is that the best design we can come up with? It's actually quite weird. Let's use business as a vehicle for the transformation we need to make, and then we can go far.
I was wondering a little bit about what has happened since your book came out. Like when if you talk to mainstream economists, how do they react to the donut model, and do they defend the neoclassical theory somehow, or do they also realize that this is maybe a change that is actually needed?
And do you want me to talk about economists as in academic economists in universities, or sort of economists practicing in kind of policy advisors?
I think you can choose what you think. I mean, which meetings that you've had that might be
Okay.
interesting to, yeah.
Okay. When I wrote Doughnut Economics, my intention was to write it to transform the teaching of economics, because that's what I'd studied 30 years ago, and that had left me so frustrated. And I was appalled that so many students around the world studying economics in universities today are still taught those ideas. But by the way, with many, many, many more layers of maths on top. So it's become a highly mathematized field of thought. Sitting underneath all that maths are some very profound relationships that need re-examining. Is the environment a small concern within the world of economics, or actually is the economy fully embedded in the living world and therefore a subset of it? That's transformational. That changes every single equation. So I wanted to write a book that would transform the teaching of economics. And so far on that, I've failed, in the sense that the place that I have seen least traction, least openness to change is in departments of economics in universities. The textbooks are so established, the ways of teaching are so ingrained, and the mathematics has become so integral to what's seen as a good economics graduate that they've almost not engaged. Now, of course, there are some places and some teachers who do outstanding things and bring the donut into their first lesson on macroeconomics. But when I open most economics textbooks, it still starts with, welcome to economics. Here is supply and demand. Let's start with the market. Why do we start with the market? Why don't we start with the living world and our goals? No, they start with the market, and they still teach a very market-centered vision, and environmental consideration is a nice thing to talk about, maybe in chapter 7 or 8 or 9. Oh yes, we must protect the living world. Let's act on climate change. But then we keep moving and we talk about finance and banking as if these things are disconnected. So it's the space I've seen probably the least transformation over the last 10 years since I first drew the donut, and 5 years since I published this book. What has happened is many other disciplines have come and said, we want to engage. Development studies, architecture, political science, geography. Geographers like, this makes sense. This always made sense. What's not to like? Business schools, that's interesting, right? Business schools say, yes, we need this, because business schools, even though that's economics, business schools definitely exist in the real world. Businesses have supply chains, and supply chains get hit by droughts. Supply chains get hit by labor relations disputes. Supply chains are hit when the global system is disrupted. So business schools engage with this. And so I've put my energy where the energy is. I don't knock on any shut doors. And I think I'm being harsh here, but hey, let's be harsh for a moment. I think economics is really at a risk of turning itself into an obscure form of mathematics. I was speaking just last week with some students studying economics at one of the world's most famous universities in the United States. And they said, well, nobody's interested in a theory until you can show the maths works. I said, I'm not interested in the maths until you can show me that the theory actually belongs on this planet. So let's sort the fundamentals out first before we turn it into a set of equations. And there's also a real problem, I think, with that role of mathematization, is that it means any student who doesn't think about the world in terms of maths sort of drifts away and said, oh, I thought economics would be quite exciting and quite political and engaging, but it's just a lot of maths problems, one after another. I think I'll change subjects. So we depoliticize economics by chasing out those students who bring a more power relations angle to it, who think about it more sociologically, and we turn it into a problem set of maths. This means that we need many more people involved in public policy than merely the economists. We need biomimicry thinkers, we need ecologists, we need social thinkers. And I think that economics is risking, maybe the world is better if the economist's view is no longer held in such high esteem, because it's actually too narrow for the realities of the complex world we live in. There we go. There's me just taking down economics. Oh, yeah.
I was thinking of when you talked about market, and it sounded to me like you thought that markets really need to change.
Yes.
And in what way? And another question in that context is it now time for moving towards economic democracy?
So markets are really powerful, like I said, but they need to be embedded wisely in the economy. I think of markets as a little bit like fire. incredibly powerful at transforming things and burning them up. But we're really careful about what we allow to catch fire. So we should also be really careful about where we think it's suitable to allow a market to exist and which areas of life are not suitable for markets. Sorry, what was I going to say? Following on from that, sometimes people talk about the free market. I'm sorry. There's no such thing as a free market. I've never been to any country in the world that I think could say this is a free market. Markets are embedded in our economies. They're embedded in our cultural relationships and our social relationships. They're embedded in regulation. In every country, there are things you can and cannot buy and sell and do through the market. So it's always embedded. And when we change the regulations, companies like to talk about deregulation. I would say don't think about deregulation. It's just re-regulation. We're changing the rules. Always ask in whose interests, in whose favor are these rules being changed? If we take away some environmental protections, if we reduce the power of unions, we are re-regulating in favor of a different group. So we need to get rid of the language of the idea of, oh, we need free markets and we should cut the red tape. Language is very powerful, just like pictures are powerful. We need to recognize that all markets are embedded and that also that the market needs to work alongside other ways that we provision to meet our needs and wants. Mainstream economics says, welcome to economics, here's the market, and sticks the market at the center of our vision on day one. That's a very political act. And most economists don't realize what they're doing there. But by saying, welcome to economics, here's the art of household management, and I give you the market, it puts the market as if this is the first way that we're going to address problems. It centers price, which is at that crisscross of supply and demand. It centers price at the center of our vision. So this becomes the metric. So price value becomes the metric through which so much of economics is done. And then if something falls outside of the price contract, economists call it an externality. Oh, because it's external to the price exchange in that contract. Kind of makes sense internally to itself, kind of makes sense to itself. But this means we find ourselves talking about the ongoing death of much of the living world. Economists will say, yes, that's what we call an environmental externality. Well, I'm sorry, if we're going to talk about the death of the living world as an environmental externality, that is information enough to me that this framework does not work for our times. The death of the living world is not an externality. It is the foundation of all life on which everything depends, including, of course, the success of an economy. So we need to overthrow that framing and start somewhere else. I start with what I call the embedded economy diagram. Do you want me? Shall I? Hang on. Why not? Why not do this? And if you want, you can cut this out and show a diagram. But here we are. So whenever I teach economics, I start with what I call the embedded economy. All right, here it is. The economy. Here it is. It's embedded in society. It's a social construct. Economic relations are entirely socially constructed. The beauty of that is that we designed them and therefore we can redesign them. And society is embedded in the living world, humanity in relation to the rest of nature. We draw on Earth's materials and we put out waste and pollution. So our economies need to work with and within the cycles of the living world. And for anybody interested in ecological economics, this is the first and biggest point of ecological economics. The economy exists within the living world. If you start there, everything that follows changes. But let me dive inside. The economy is not just made up of the market, which is where mainstream economics starts. There's also the state, where we provide public goods and tax people in return. But these two show up in GDP or gross domestic product or national income. This is what gets measured when we say what was the economic output of a country in a year. This is what gets measured as in, is the economy growing or not? The value, the financial value of the goods and services that are sold in a year in these sectors. But that's just a section of what I believe it creates value in our economies. There's the household where we all begin every day. It's the cooking, washing, cleaning, sweeping, raising the children, the reproductive labor that makes us fresh and ready for work the next day. It's unpaid, but it's essential to life and to society. And there's the commons, which is a place where people come together, not through the market of buying and selling things, not through the state of public goods, but as a community, where people create a set of rules and agreements of how they'll behave together to co-create goods and services that they collectively value. You can think of Wikipedia on the World Wide Web. You can think of a neighborhood garden on the corner of your block. These create value, often without money changing hands. So it's not, none of this is showing up in what we call national income, but it's crucial. So we need to recognize that markets are powerful, and sometimes they can be the most effective way for meeting our wants and needs, as long as everybody has income to participate in them, and as long as that they are not exploiting both society and the living world. And that means we need good, clear regulation from the state to provide that regulatory environment and to protect the household from the market, to protect the commons from the market. I think the neoliberalism that certainly in the UK and the US and many other countries have lived through for decades really saw markets first. And the market has crowded out the space. It's rolled back the state. Ronald Reagan particularly wanted to roll back the state and undermine its value. The market has often crowded out the household, reducing, infringing on people's time at home, reducing maternity leave, for example, very short maternity leave in countries that are very strongly dominated by the market, let alone any paternity leave at all. And it's crowding out the commons. It's trying to privatize and claim patents and copyrights to practices and knowledge that have been in the commons and often in the indigenous commons for millennia. We need to rein back in the market and make sure that it plays a role, but in balance with providing all these other ways, in balance with provisioning publicly, in balance with respecting not only maternity leave, but parental leave, and that we have time to care for our families and ourselves, respecting the commons and making new space for the commons, which particularly with the digital society and digital economy has a huge new potential. So markets embedded in relation to these other forms of provisioning embedded in the world. And here in the middle is finance. Finance is key. Is finance going to be in service to itself, which I think the financial system has pretty much been in service to itself for decades? Or is finance going to be redesigned so that it's in service to this real economy, in service to human thriving on a living planet? That's a deep design that needs to happen.
I'm curious about self-organizing, and I think you talk about healthy hierarchy.
Oh, I didn't answer your question about a market economic democracy.
Yeah,
But that's connected to the self-organized.
yeah,
Well, maybe,
yeah.
yeah.
It is. It is. So where are we when it comes to democracy and economic democracy and creating a system that makes people in general as creative as possible and able to participate?
So we often think about democracy in the political sphere. And of course, political democracy goes far beyond voting once every 4 years. We can have deliberative democracy through citizens' assemblies, through much more local, deliberative, and distributed decision making. But we can also work towards economic democracy, where the economy is governed, is owned, and is in service of the values and the interests of a far broader proportion of society. How can we do that? I'm going to come back to the deep design of institutions. So, thinking of business, how is business owned and financed? We're beginning to see the rise or even the return of enterprises that are far more economically democratic because they're not owned by shareholders, very, very wealthy shareholders who may be in another country whose only interest in the company is that it extracts as much financial value as possible for them. Companies can be owned by their employees. They can be owned by their customers. So we're seeing the rise and return of cooperatives, of employee-owned companies who then have a lot of voice in the governance, in the decision making of the board. To me, this is a really good example of economic democracy that can arise up from the systems we've inherited, but transforming how things are owned and governed and financed brings back that democratic voice. In larger companies, we can see economic democracy beginning to come into play, of bringing the workers' voice, the union voice into the board, into governance, into decision making. We can also bring in the voice of nature. How can nature have a seat at the table? How can future generations have a seat at the table, so that things are governed not only for the short-term interests of the financial owners, but for the long-term interests of society, of the workers, of the living world? I think also in terms of economic democracy, we can ask ourselves which goods and services are best provided by the market and which can be best provided by the state and publicly. So we're seeing a return of realizing the value of public service provision. Many countries since the 1980s have privatized water, privatized the railways, privatized electricity, and certainly the country I live in, and now seeing the downside of that, that these services actually aren't run in the interest of the public, they're run in the interest of the shareholders. So some countries, let's take Paris actually as a city, for example, it privatized its water supply in the 1980s and then realized what a loss that was, both over the control of water, which matters so much, but also the revenue that comes from that. So they've now brought it back under public control, so that the finance that's raised through running the water system goes back into the public interest, and water is managed in the city for the public good. What about education and healthcare and childcare and transport and social housing? Some cities, for example, have very dominantly privatized housing. And so you get extreme rent crises and some landlords owning hundreds of properties because they see housing not as a human right, but they see it as a good investment that giving higher and more stable returns than some of their stocks and shares and bonds and commodity price and commodity trading. So they invest in housing, and housing is treated like an investment. In the city of Vienna, many decades ago, the city decided that housing actually isn't an investment asset, it's a human right. And so a lot of the city's housing is owned by the city or by city run cooperatives. And more than 60% of people in that city live in what we would call social housing. That is affordable, it's rent controlled, it's owned by the city or the city cooperative, it's central, it's good quality, it's normal. This just shows again that it all goes back to the deep design. How do we choose for these fundamental assets, whether it's housing or transport or water or energy, to be owned? And it's not just a choice between the market and the state. We also have the commons. And we're seeing again in many places the rise of community energy ownership, community land trusts, community owned housing. We need new kinds of contracts and new kinds of commoning to make this possible, because it can succeed. And it's, again, a really nice example of economic democracy that means that the sources of wealth creation in a place, in a society, whether it's land and housing or water and energy or business, the sources of wealth creation can be owned locally and can be owned communally and can ensure that the value from generating that wealth, that value is reinvested in the place. And this is what helps us to regenerate.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
Pleasure.